Good morning, everybody. First of all, and welcome to today's webinar. First of these that I've had the privilege of introducing since my own appointment as chair of the association. Today's webinar is the Introduction to Waste Management, Understanding and Managing Your Risk. So firstly, thank you to everyone for joining us, and whether you're a member of the Cleaning and Hygiene Suppliers Association or joining us from elsewhere in industry, you are very welcome, and we're very pleased to have you with us. We are hosting this webinar as part of our roadmap to sustainability and our commitment to informing and educating members about significant issues affecting their business. Waste management is increasingly complex with new regulatory requirements, growing customer expectations, and the potential for significant financial and reputational risk. Today's introductory webinar is intended to provide a structured, practical overview of the landscape for shaping waste management in the UK. And we're fortunate to be joined by three highly experienced experts. First, Tina Benfield, Technical Manager at the Chartered Institute of Waste Management, who will discuss the current waste management landscape, including simpler recycling and closed-loop schemes. We'll then hear from Craig Berman, Solicitor at Berman Environmental Law, who will outline the legal framework, duty of care obligations, and potential consequences of non-compliance. And finally, we'll hear from Mike Hibbert, an experienced waste management consultant with nearly 4 decades of sector experience, and he will share practical advice on implementing effective waste management systems and managing contractor relationships. We'll take questions at the end of the presentations, but please feel free to post your questions in the chat throughout, and we'll do our best to address as many as possible during the Q&A. So thank you again for joining us, and I will now hand over to our first speaker, Tina Benfield. Thank you, Tina.
Thanks, Nick, for an introduction. Yes, sort of the amount of years of experience you got from me and Mike is probably pretty substantial about what we know and the changes we get. And yes, this does change quite dramatically. I've been in the institution for 27 years and I'll still keep picking stuff up. So what I'm going to try and give you a background is very much some of the basics of what you should know. And if you don't know some of this stuff, you probably are not being compliant enough or sort of putting yourselves at risk of being caught out on some of the things. So go to the next slide, please, Kathy. So the basics. The basics one is duty of care is the fundamental basic. This basically tells you what you need to do, and following this does give you a good background on compliance with your waste. So if you know what you've got, you know where it's going, and you know what you're doing with it, that is more or less the building blocks of waste management. It's one of the courses that we've got in CRM that basically a lot of people come along and sort of go, oh, wow, this has really helped me. There's little bits in there that you don't quite get. So this gives us the basis, and everything beyond that is impacted. So any changes like duty of care covers carriers and brokers. We know there are changes coming to this. We've been expecting these changes for nigh on probably 5+ years. They've finally got round to giving us an outline of what it's going to be. So they're now calling them transporters and handlers and things like that. So carriers, brokers, dealers, same roles, but different names. And it's changing across not just England. There will be impacts again. Some people may do business in Scotland and Wales. So again, you have to be aware of those changes in each country. They are slightly different, but they do make a difference as well to how you label, package, and everything else that your waste, where you're moving it to. And another one that again is impacted is digital waste tracking. So you may have heard of DWT. We love our acronyms in waste. And digital waste tracking is basically electronic version of duty of care. So duty of care is a paperwork system. You have to understand what you've got, follow the paperwork, have the paperwork, keep the paperwork. digital waste tracking basically makes that all electronic. So again, you'll end up putting all the similar information that you have into an electronic system, which you may already have yourself. So it's basically adding to your system. So next slide, please. So I'm going to cover that in a little bit more detail. The notes I have on the right-hand side, as I see it, I hope it's the right-hand side for you, is to give you a little bit more information. I'm not going to necessarily go into all of that detail there, but it will help you understand some of what I'm going to say. So, duty of care, as I said, is building blocks. You have responsibilities as a waste producer. There are things that you must do to comply. So you need to know what waste you've got. You need to be able to put any classification and coding on it so that it then helps the person who is picking up your material and taking it away for you, that they handle it properly and take it to the right place. So your carrier registration is key to that. As I said, this is changing to collection and transport because carriers and broken dealers is changing under the regime, but the only part of that is extra requirements that you have to comply to as a carrier. They are then trying to piece all these bits and pieces together, but the biggest change for them is you have to be technically competent to actually have a carrier registration. Whereas before it's just sign, pay, do the job. You now have to have some technical competence to allow you to actually hold that registration because it's now a permitted registration. So under permits, you have to be technically competent. So for carrier registration, you have to be technically competent. So that makes a big difference to your carrier. So consequently, it's another thing you can check under your duty of care that they are compliant and they are technically competent. So it gives more responsibility to you, but it gives you less confidence, the more confidence that they are doing the right thing because you can then double check. Next slide, please, Kathy. So digital waste tracking. A lot of people may have heard of this, may not know what it is, and fully understand what it's going to do. It is going to be a digital system to gather all of UK waste movements. And originally in the consultation, again, we've been waiting for this a while, was originally to put out a system to cover all aspects. When DEFRA looked at it, they realised that it's actually quite a big thing to do. It's not an easy thing to digitise waste movements. So they've now gone for a phased approach. As I put there, October for England and Wales, and January is when Scotland comes in. And it's for receiving sites. So really it's for your carrier taking the material to whatever their next destination is. So whether it goes to a transfer station or it goes to a MRF or something else, they are then basically the ones that do have to do the recording. So all it's currently planning to do is digitise what we currently have under duty of care. So receiving sites report what they receive, what they then take out of their facility and pass on to somebody else. That is now becoming the digitised part. So it's fully digitising what we currently do all in one system. And in phase 2, hopefully, we'll then bring in everybody else. And that is, again, a big part of the waste movements. And it's a large number of sites for this. Because basically, it's everybody that hasn't been brought in up to this point. The only addition to this, as I've put on the notes, that it does, because duty of care is the part where you comply with it. So you need to know your waste, you need to know what code is, you need to be able to put that information in. And the extra addition to this is you need to know what mode of transport is being used. And that's different. That's not something you have to do under duty of care, but it's something they're asking for under DWT. For those people that don't understand how this is going to work, you may well have your own system because you may use it for invoicing. So again, your carrier comes and removes your waste from your premises. They give you an invoice and they give you some information about what the waste was, where they took it, how much it was, whether they've weighed it or whether they've given you an estimation. That information you keep, and basically they keep. And then what happens through digital waste tracking is the information that they have on their system is then uploaded into digital waste tracking through what they call an API. It's a bit of code that basically reads the carrier's system and then takes that information into DWT and stores it. It only takes the information that's relevant to duty of care. It doesn't take everything, so it doesn't have all your information in relation to invoices and stuff. It only asks or is written to take in the duty of care part of your transactions. So that's that bit. I'm sure there may be some questions on that. And again, like I say, there's a bit more information there to help you on the notes side. Next slide, please, Kathy. Can't remember how much time I've got, so I'm trying to think. Conscious I'm probably taking a lot longer than I need to. Some of the policy and technical changes I was asked to cover: simpler recycling, anything but. Plastic film, again, because that is part of simpler recycling. Major changes for collection, major changes not just for households but for businesses. Emissions trading scheme, you may have heard of ETS, and again, as I said, we love acronyms. That makes quite a big difference in relation to and is tied to simpler recycling of plastic film. And again, we also have POPs and PFASs, which are impacted by some of these things, or also impact some of these particular asks that are now coming in as well. So next slide, please, Kathy. So simpler recycling was for England only, and you had to have done it by March last year. So if you're not doing it, you really should be. This is something that you should already have in place. You should already be doing your separation, including your food. The big difference now is you then got plastic film coming in. And so micro businesses come in 2027, but that's a very particular size of organisation, and it probably isn't relevant to very many sort of people on here. I'm only guessing, could be completely wrong. Scotland and Wales obviously already had this in place. If you're wondering why this is England only, they already had they didn't call it simpler recycling, they just basically called it just changes to their collection systems. So they've had that guidance has been available in Scotland and Wales for quite some time. The only difference is food waste has a de minimis, certainly in Scotland. In England, it does not, and it's caused agony for a large number of organisations because you have to collect 3 tea bags. So if you've got 3 tea bags, you have to collect it. So it's a big problem for a lot of businesses is how they manage that. There are ways of doing it, but it's something you have to think about how to do. And again, it's a cost if you've only got a very small amount of food waste to collect. Plastic film will make a difference to all businesses because again, it's quite volume. It's very light and it's quite difficult even for people to collect. There's another reason why it was phased in instead of all at the same time as everything else, because we've got to think about from a sector how we collect it and manage it, let alone how you actually do that within your own premises. So again, that's another change. You've got to then think about how you store this and manage this in your own premises besides handing it over for our sector to sort of pick up and manage. So next slide, please, Kathy. So detail in relation to ETS is this looks at fossil carbon. So for our sector, we are being brought into the emissions trading scheme. Emission trading scheme has been around for quite a long time for major industries. So anybody producing a large amount of energy or using a large amount of energy comes under ETS because they then have to sort of show that their carbon emissions are reduced. How are they reducing their carbon emissions? Our particular angst is plastic adds to our carbon emissions. So by taking plastic out, and hence the fact that we've got simpler recycling taking those plastics out and certainly taking now film out, reduces our impact of emissions trading scheme, which is good because the less carbon that our sector produces, the less cost it is to us and the less cost that we then pass on to you as producers of that material. So the more plastic you can get out of your system that then doesn't get used for energy from waste, considering most material does now go through energy from waste, if it's not recycled, means that you then stand a chance of not having such a big bill added to your collection scheme. Added to this is POPs and PFAS, which does arrive in some plastics, does arrive in many materials that we have. So POPs is basically persistent organic pollutants. So anything that hangs around, it's usually solvents. It's not always, but it's usually solvents. And PFAS is a very particular POP. And both of these and a lot of others are listed under the Stockholm Convention. So we have to oblige to remove these from the waste stream. Those that are still there have to be treated. And the only treatment mechanism so far that is, I say, guaranteed is destruction through incineration. That impacts on us because, again, it impacts on emission trading scheme, carbon emissions, because it's plastic based. Then we end up having to put plastic through the system. We then have to pay for that carbon emission. So if you've got any materials, and obviously soft furnishings was the one that caused a lot of joy for many local authorities, that has to go through incineration. It may well, as we find out in the future, impact on carbon emissions, depending on what they're made of. And then obviously the monitoring that those organisations have to do to then report their emissions, they then get charged for that. So again, it's all an interesting mix for us. It's all the stuff we're learning about and having to manage at the same time as everything else that we have to do and other changes we've got. So hopefully that's give you a taster. It's probably made things a little bit more interesting for you, but hopefully, I think because that's my last slide, we can then move on to Craig.
Thanks, Tina. Good morning, everybody. Bear with me while I share my screen. Hopefully you can all see that. I have 15 minutes to talk to you about waste legislation, which has taken me almost a lifetime to learn. So it's going to be a very quick and dirty look at 3 key pieces of legislation, which I think are probably the most applicable to your sector and where people routinely get things wrong. So it's a bit of a heads up as to what you can do to keep yourself compliant. For some reason, I can't get my... Here we are. So the two pieces of legislation I'm going to look at today is the Environmental Permitting England and Wales Regulations 2016 and the Environmental Protection Act 1990. And both of those really govern waste, how it's managed, how it's dealt with. I'm also then going to look at the sentencing guidelines, which will give you a snapshot into how the courts deal with things when they don't go to plan. But what is waste? And the definition of waste, rather unhelpfully in the Waste Framework Directive, is anything that is discarded, is intended to be discarded, or is required to be discarded. So there's lots of scope there for debate. And what the courts do generally, and the regulators, is they look at things objectively rather than subjectively. So it's an evidence-based assessment of how the material has been dealt with, rather than just what the holder says they're going to do with it or have done with it. Looking at the environmental permitting regulations, and this is quite a complicated piece of legislation. It's not that easy to follow in a lot of areas. Please don't take this slide as gospel, but I've tried to distill it down to the most basic in relation to waste. So what the regulations say in Regulation 2, that any recovery or disposal of waste is defined as a waste operation, and a waste operation in Regulation 8 is defined as a regulated facility, and regulated facilities, courtesy of Regulations 5 and 12, must be either permitted or exempt. Now that's a very, as I say, high level look at it, but that's how we get to the point in waste where if you're dealing with waste, you need to make sure that what happens to it happens under a permit or an exemption. Under the Environmental Protection Act 1990, and this was the key legislation for waste for a long time until the EPR came into force. So they run almost in tandem together, these two pieces of legislation, and there's a bit of overlap. This is more about the deposit of waste and the handling of waste on the ground. But again, it says that without an authorization, which is either a permit or an exemption, you must not deposit waste or submit waste to a listed operation. And listed operations fall under 2 main categories, either disposal, like landfill, or recovery, so recycling and reuse. You must not knowingly cause or knowingly permit the deposit of controlled waste or submit to a listed operation. And what amounts to knowingly cause or knowingly permit has been the subject of lively debate, and it was settled by the Court of Appeal some years ago. It is, you do not have to know that what's happening is unlawful, and you don't have to know the detail of what's happening. If you know that your waste is being dealt with by or somewhere and things go wrong, that is likely to suffice. And the leading case is called Walker and Sons. They leased a section of their yard out to a waste company who did a lot of things wrong. The landlord, Walkers, were prosecuted. They said, well, we knew it was a waste operation, but we didn't know what was happening. And we didn't know the detail. And the Court of Appeal said, well, that satisfies the test for knowingly. So that is the knowingly permit, knowingly cause arises in both pieces of legislation. So that tends to drag producers, distributors into the frame when things go wrong. So the waste chain, something down the line with your waste, can result in you being in the firing line. And of course, under Section 33, you mustn't do anything with waste that's likely to cause pollution or harm to human health. So most waste operators operate under an environmental permit, and some environmental permits apply to production facilities, and you may have them if you are producing or emitting to air, etc. But if you are importing, distributing, you're unlikely to have an environmental permit. So I'm not going to go into the exemptions that you apply for under the EPR to allow waste processing and some activities. They're another story for another day. But these are 3 exemptions in the Waste Framework Directive that every business can use without registration. They're called non-waste framework directives. They're there to be used providing you can comply with them. The first one, I think, is the most useful, and that's temporary storage of waste at the place of production. So if you have, if you're the waste producer and your waste is being generated on the site that you occupy, you can store it for 12 months at that site, providing that it's stored securely. What amounts to secure storage, I think, again, is up for debate. I struggle with a skip on the road outside someone's house being a secure storage of waste, but apparently it is, and it's quite a common way that waste is dealt with. So again, lively debate about secure storage, but there's no upper limit on that. It can be stored for 12 months and it's available to anybody without registration. Temporary storage at the place controlled by the producer. This is particularly useful if you control, if you are the producer of waste, but it's generated at your client's premises. The requirements for this one is, first of all, it must be a place that the producer controls. Storage is only up to 3 months. It must be secure. You mustn't mix different wastes or waste streams. You can't be a waste management company to make use of this, so no payment for waste. And there's limits. I think it's 50 cubic meters of solid waste, 1,000 liters of liquid waste that's bunded, and there's also restrictions on things like asbestos and flammable material. But good if your waste is brought back to be collected, but be careful that you stay within the limits. And then temporary storage at a collection point, again, it's largely for bulking up, and it's for people that don't produce on site. So again, it's slightly less restrictions than number 3, but you can't mix waste. If it's waste electrical and electronic, 30 cubes is your limit. If it's non-haz and non-WE, it's 50 cube, and anything else hazardous is 5 cube. Again, no asbestos or highly flammable, and you can't be paid for waste collection services. So they're the way that most businesses handle and store their waste. I am constantly surprised by how often it's not done properly And the takeaway on this aspect is you might want to audit how you deal with your waste and make sure that you're within those 3 exemptions if you don't have a permit. So let's go for duty of care, and Tina has already mentioned it. In a nutshell, if you produce, keep, dispose, import, carry, or treat waste, you have a duty, and it's the same duty, to take all applicable measures to either prevent someone else from committing an offence, prevent the waste escaping, make sure your waste only goes with somebody authorised to carry it to an authorised facility, and when you transfer it, to make sure there's a written description which allows everybody to know what it is and not commit an offence. And you'll notice that the obligation to prepare waste transfer notes and describe the waste sits with the producer rather than the carrier or company. And I think that's a major disconnect. Mostly waste transfer notes and consignment notes are produced by the waste company or by the haulier, but the obligation is on the producer. So bear that in mind. I won't take you through the detail of the wording of the section, but I think 5 takeaways from me in relation to duty of care is: be compliant in your storage, know what your waste is and how it's described and what EWC codes apply, know where it's going, and I think knowing where it's going is, as a minimum, asking, where is my waste being taken to, and can you supply me with a copy of the environmental permit for the receiving site and the waste carrier registration. It's not just enough to get that and put it in a drawer. You've got to actually look at and make sure that your waste code is on the permit and it can receive it. And that's often, I find people they've obtained a copy of the documents, they just haven't analysed them. Know what the receiving site can take, and that's a permit review, and keep accurate records and keep them for 3 years. And I say 3 years here, it's 2 years for waste transfer notes, it's 3 years for hazardous waste consignment notes. I can't see a good reason not to keep everything for at least 3 years. So that would be my suggestion. Going back to digital waste tracking, which Tina has covered, I think this is an excellent opportunity for you to make your duty of care easier. But I think what's going to happen is, if you are a customer of a waste company, you're going to be offered their digital waste tracking system. It may or may not work in with the other record keeping that you've got. It may sit apart, or it may be integrated, I don't know. As a producer, just give some thought to how you make the most of this process. Are you going to end up with somebody else's system that doesn't quite work for you? Or are you going to be able to integrate it into your other systems and make life a lot easier? Because I think it is an opportunity. A few years ago, we went through a phase of being told that we should be following skip wagons to find out where our waste is going. And happily, I think we've moved back away from that, although some people still do. But knowing your duty of care, in particular to your operation and how you're going to comply with it, is something, as Tina said, it's fundamental. If you get that wrong, nothing else really works. So when things don't go to plan, let's have a look at what happens. And this, I'm not going to go through all the offences and frighten you all, but I'm going to touch on sort of the high level. If you're storing, consigning, transporting, disposing, and keeping paperwork, these are the areas on the screen now that I think are not done as well as they could be. So, for example, not being in compliance with the exemption that you're storing waste under, increasing risk of fire or pollution, not doing your due diligence checks sufficiently, not making sure your waste transfer notes are filled in correctly. If you're moving your own waste, most of you hopefully know that you need to be a low tier waste carrier to do that. But I think some people are still not registered. And I think disposal is where most of the problems arise. And largely it's often not the producer that gets it wrong, it's someone else down the chain, and all comes back up to cause problems. So they're the issues. if something does go wrong, the courts deal with this generally. There's a matrix based on what your turnover is, what harm has been created, it's a risk of harm or actual harm, and how culpable or blameworthy you are. And that matrix gets plugged in by the courts when assessing penalties. And just bear in mind here, going back to what I said about often the producers aren't the ones making the mistakes. You live or die by how good your waste chain is down the line, because liability doesn't necessarily stop just when the waste leaves your site. So culpability, 4 categories from deliberate, which is the most serious, to low or no culpability. Harm is categorized in 4 categories as a major adverse, significant adverse, minor adverse, and no harm but a risk of minor adverse. And then organizations are divided into 4 categories based on turnover: above 50 million, 10 to 50, 2 to 10 million, and then below 2. And these are all plugged into a matrix in the sentencing guidelines for environmental offences, and that's where the courts set fines. And the next slide should bring you to attention, if you haven't already, because they're big fines. Gone are the days that people get a slap on the wrist. So for a large company, so 50 million turnover and over, I've just put 2 categories there: deliberate offending and reckless offending. And you'll see on the left-hand column, so category 1, the most serious, the starting point for the fine is £1 million, with a range of 450 to 3 million. And the same offence but committed recklessly rather than deliberately, you'll see that the starting point drops to 550,000 with a range of 250 to 1.5 million. And they drop down again for negligent and for low culpability. But you can see that we're talking, even for a large company committing an offence with no environmental impact whatsoever, the starting point is still £100,000. Add to that as well that the courts have to remove any financial benefit from the offending. So not only will you have a fine, if you've made money by either not being compliant or by not taking the steps you should have taken, generally the avoided costs will be added to the fine. There'll be prosecution costs. It's very expensive. And then you've got the reputational impact, which is really hard to put a figure on. But I know lots of companies with good track records find it very difficult when they're convicted. It has a big impact for tendering, for insurance, for declarations. So being compliant is obviously worth putting some money into and some effort into. And that's me. I will finish at this point. I'll take questions at the end of it after Mike, but my one takeaway, or my big takeaway, is that things may always go wrong despite best endeavours, but you need best endeavours there to demonstrate what you've done and to minimise the impact. And I will stop sharing. And Mike, I will hand over to you.
Okay, thank you, Craig. Hopefully Kathy is going to bring up some slides. Lovely. All right, so let's jump forward and slightly back as well. So on the next slide, I'm just raising the point with you to think about why, as businesses and organisations, are you generating waste in the first place? Because if we don't have that waste to deal with, it's simpler legally, logistically, a lot of the issues and problems that Tina and Craig have talked about disappear. So why is your business ending up with waste material? Is that down to how you're purchasing material and you end up with stuff left over? Is it down to product design? That means that you mean waste generated from that production process? Or as to business I was talking to the other day, they have steel delivered to their site and it comes on wooden pallets and they can't recycle them, so they end up with skipfuls of timber that they have to manage and dispose of. Whereas possibly getting that raw material delivered in a different way means that that packaging wouldn't arrive with you in the first place, and that can be transit packaging as well. So why have we got the waste in the first place? Can we eliminate that? Okay, so if we look at the next bit on the next slide, do you know what waste you're actually generating? It may all be going into a skip or a container, but do we know what's in there? Have we done some auditing of our residual waste to see if there's anything that can be recycled, how well we're doing that? How much waste we're actually generating? And does your collection include an element of weight? So are you paying for weight or just by container lift? In which case you might actually be paying more than you need to. Getting that data about how much waste you're generating can then allow you to target better where that waste is coming from and try and eliminate it. Tina had talked about POPs and PFAS. It's a classic example of toxics in, toxics out. So if you're using raw materials that have hazards associated with them, then they might well be hazardous waste when you dispose of them, or the residues, and that's going to be more expensive. Simple as that. And then there's also the hidden costs around waste disposal. So it's very easy to look at your bill at the end of the month and go, right, that's how much it's costing for my contractor to take materials away. But that again is masking the fact that you are buying raw material and throwing it away. So there is a cost associated with that. There is things like staff labour to actually manage your waste on site, put it into the correct bins. All of that is that hidden cost to your business. So stripping those out and trying to stop generating waste can have significant savings in there. It's really down, as Craig has mentioned, it's really down to the producer. They are key in knowing what wastes you have, how much you're generating, and you're also directing where that waste material goes to through your contractor or whatever arrangements you have. So your role is really important at the start of that chain. Okay, on to the next slide, Kathy. Are you compliant with the waste hierarchy? We've had the waste hierarchy for a good long while now. Regulations, this is basically ensuring that we do prevention, reuse, recycling, recovery, and then finally disposal. And the idea is that this is a priority where we try and move up the waste hierarchy using the most appropriate waste management techniques. And somebody in your business will be signing transfer notes or hazardous waste consignment notes to say that the business has had regard to the waste hierarchy. And increasingly, I think for bigger businesses, the Environment Agency and other regulators will looking for justification for some of those decisions rather than just the cheapest option. So again, how are we managing our waste and where are we sending it to? Okay, next slide, please, Kathy. So what's happening to your waste? Somebody presumably in the business is making arrangements to get rid of that waste material. The fact that you're actually being paid for it, for example, scrap metal, doesn't make any odds with regards to its legal definition of the waste. When we're appointing a contractor who's doing that, do they have experience of what waste are being generated by your organisation, or is it somebody in the procurement department who just looks at the cheapest option and signs that off? Is there any staff training so that people can ensure that they're putting the right waste materials in the right waste containers? Classic examples of this, and I'm sure Craig has got some, You know, somebody important is coming to site and there's a big clear up and everybody just shoves everything in the nearest skip, or staff don't understand why they should be segregating. So either you're putting materials into a hazardous collection, or more importantly, hazardous materials into non-hazardous waste streams. Thinking about induction of new staff, both within your business and also if you have contractors on site, what are they doing with their waste? Are they using your waste collection processes and containers? Somebody's completing the paperwork, hopefully, and that will be a controlled waste transfer note, a season ticket, or a hazardous waste consignment note if it has waste, and they're signing on behalf of the company to say that the information included in that paperwork is correct. So do they really understand that? If something was wrong, could they spot that? And this is a particular issue when you are reliant on contractors filling in the paperwork on your behalf, because it is not totally uncommon that contractors don't really know what they're doing. As with all aspects of waste, there is health and safety issues, both with your staff handling that material, but also people down the line who might have to sort or process this material. So particular issues that would be things like lithium batteries, whether they're segregated, and the fire risk at waste treatment facilities, potentially materials that might have, for instance, contamination with needles, so needle stick injuries, or materials that are generally unpleasant and need handling in a particular way, whether that be clinical waste, whether it be dog feces, bait boxes from pest control, that sort of thing. And really dealing with contractors, how you manage them, how do you appoint them? Are you getting somebody who's good? It doesn't follow that national companies are any better than local suppliers. There can be a right mishmash out there, but actually actively managing contractors, being confident about what they do and not totally reliant on them, as they might have background drivers to do with cost and where they send that material. A good resource is the website Right Waste Right Place, worth having a look at. That gives nice little infographic sheets that is good for things like staff induction. So a nice resource to dip into. Okay, let's have a look at the next slide. Producers should be the people who have an understanding of the waste and classify that material. And I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but there is regulator guidance about classification and coding of waste in WM3 version 1.2. And when you delve into that, you will see that it also incorporates the hazardous waste list. So by going through and getting your 6-digit European Waste Code or list of waste code for both transfer notes and for haz waste notes, this also tells you about whether materials are hazardous, non-hazardous, or mirror entry. And we need to have that clarification because it ties back with the issues about permitting and making sure that site material goes to the right site. It's down to you as producers, as you know best what that material is, and is particularly key for things like incinerated bottom ash, soils, contaminated soils, waste electrical equipment, pop contaminated material, to know exactly what you've got and what the coding is. Okay, next slide, Kathy. All right, and then again, Craig mentioned on the legislative issues around waste storage, but are we thinking about waste storage on our site, how that's done? There's issues potentially of arson, theft of material, people breaking into your site and fly tipping, or it might be that it's employees bringing waste from home. Storage, it is reputationally not great. If somebody as a customer turns up at your company and finds the yard full of debris, that's not great. And in certain locations, particularly city centres, there's been quite a few instances where people are climbing into bins and fatalities due to that. So think about your waste storage. Okay, next slide. We're nearly at the end. Thinking about who's managing your waste down the line. Craig mentioned briefly about maybe auditing where your waste goes. You know, are you just getting on the web on Facebook and finding somebody as a contractor, or are you formally putting out pre-qualification questionnaires, getting details about who the contractors are you're using, asking them about experience, compliance record? The one on the right here is Fly Tipping by J.R. Hartley, that some of you will remember. Okay, next slide. So not just the people who are removing it, but where it is finally going to, and whether you're confident that it's actually getting there and is actually permitted to accept that waste. I'm sure all of you have seen stuff on the television and in the press about the Environment Agency identifying a significant number of large illegal sites, virtually all over England. Biggest ones, Hodeswood in Kent, one at Kidlington in Oxfordshire. That waste has come from somewhere. There is something significantly going wrong in the waste chain, and you don't want to be in a situation where you'll find that your waste is ending up at one of those sites. So have a look at the public register, check people are registered waste carriers, check on permits, ask where the waste is going to, potentially go and have a look at the site to reassure yourself that it is actually legitimate and waste is being handled appropriately. And last but not least, if you do nothing else after today, download the copy of the Waste Duty of Care Code of Practice and have a read through that. It will tell you exactly what you need to do. And if you found yourself in court and somebody is asking you what measures you have taken, you can say that you've read the Code of Practice, you've complied with that, and you've put in place those measures, and basically the problem has arisen further down the chain. Okay, that's my lot, and I'm just presumably now we're going to pick up any questions.
Yes, there's a couple of questions in the chat at the moment, or in the Q&A at the moment, but if anyone's got any other questions that they'd like to pose, just pop them in the Q&A or the chat. One is, the first one is, do we have to set a new bin or sort plastic materials that has PFAS in it? I think that popped up when you were speaking, Tina.
It was, yeah. The big problem is it's quite a complicated thing to understand, because all the solvents, all the pots, so there's lots of different chemicals that have been listed on Stockholm. They go in at different times when they decide that they are an impact on the environment, and so consequently they are then phased out of use. So if they were listed about 5 years ago, you're probably pretty confident if you've got something within that window of 5 years ago, it's probably not going to have POPs in it. If you're going something beyond that, so if it's a material or a product that's arrived from 15 years ago, you then have to question what that product has got on it. So, for example, PFASs are used in firefighting foam. So if you then, obviously most people have got fire extinguishers, you will then obviously have them being checked every time. So they'll obviously then determine what the content of that is. So whoever your company is doing, they should then be managing the disposal of that appropriately. Other items are things like frying pans. So again, frying pans, yes, it's a home thing, but there may be some that have them in their sort of catering aspect of their business. There may also be another area is some plastics do have them as a coating. But again, it depends on how old that item is. So that's the biggest issue you have to sort of think about, is dating that item. So if it falls after the window when they were listed, you're reasonably confident that they have not. If you cannot be confident from either a safety data sheet or anything else, you have to assume and then treat it as containing POPs and then destroy it in the appropriate manner. So yes, segregation is good if you do know what you've got. If you don't, you then have to determine segregation, because it's a material that then contains POPs, and that's how it's listed for its takeaway point for the carrier. The carrier has to understand it has got POPs in it. Whether you designate it is another question, but you do have to have some separation if you do know, and if you're unsure, again, segregate it and let code it as such.
Okay, thank you. The next question in the Q&A is, will the requirement for competency of waste carriers affect lower tier licenses for carrying your own waste? I think
that is a very interesting question, and it's not obvious from the legislation at the moment, because it's not in play. And again, there is a phased transition, I think. So most of those that are registered at the moment will have a phased transition until their registration runs out. So if you've registered your carrier registration, for example, say December last year, you have got probably until 12 months after that. So by the time your registration runs out and the regulations change, you will then have to re-register under the new regime. If you've only just managed to get your registration redone, so you've just done it in May or June, you then got another 12 months round. So it's a transition, so you're not having to do it immediately. And I don't know yet, because I know there is discussion still with DEFRA on the technical competence aspects of this. And I don't know yet whether they've determined there has to be, but I get the impression that if you are a lower tier or an exempt registration, so a lot of it is if you're, depending on whether you're frequently or regularly carrying waste, you will then have to show that you are going to follow, as Mike mentioned, the waste hierarchy. If you can't show that you know that you can do that as a carrier, they may well not allow you to have registration as an exempt registration. You may then have to go through a permit route, but it's something they haven't, I don't think, made very clear. The legislation is not clear. I've been looking while we've been talking to see if I can find an answer to that. It's not evident. If I do find a definite answer, I can at least pass that on. But at the moment, I think we're still in the let's sort it all out. We're not quite sure. The guidance hasn't been written and everything else. Not a brilliant answer, but yeah, we're there. We're keeping an eye on it. And yes, if we find anything, we'll pass on what we can.
I think the current guidance about reforms is quite vague on this area. And my guess is that somebody doesn't know the answer yet.
I wouldn't be surprised, Craig.
Yeah, I suspect that no firm decision has been made yet. Watch this space, I think.
Here's another question for you, Craig. Is there any formal or informal guidance or a litmus test through which waste producers can satisfy themselves that they have taken all reasonable steps or best endeavours?
I think if there was, I'd be out of a job. My answer, I suppose, with some help from Mike, might be that the duty of care code of practice is probably the place to start. But you've really got to apply it to your business, and then and also to what waste you're producing and who's taking it away and where. If it's all going to a waste transfer station 3 or 4 miles down the road, then it's a relatively straightforward process to look at the permit, speak to the operator, and just keep an eye on the documents that you're getting. But if you separate your waste into different fractions and they're going different places, it becomes a lot more of a complicated process. So I think in a true lawyer fashion, no, there's no easy answer to that question unless Tina and Mike know otherwise.
Well, I think it'll also depend on what waste streams you've got and how many contractors and everything else you've got. As Mike sort of said, you've got to know who you're contracting to do waste streams, because you might have somebody different for hazardous waste to somebody else for, you know, special waste, i.e. as in like materials and recycling material that you know you can stockpile, you know, I'm pretty sure that's how you would try and advise people, isn't it, Mike, to then work out what streams you've got to then can you find somebody that does it all for you, or are you looking at separate companies?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't briefly touched in your introduction, Tina, quite a number of companies use brokers of one form or another. There might be a total waste management contract. So in theory, you're sort of, as a producer, you're going, right, well, I'm handling all of that day-to-day, sorting out everything, contractors, where it goes to, and all the rest of it to you. And those, obviously, those brokers have got responsibility under duty of care. But I still would want to be in a situation that I could stand in court and say, yeah, I've checked and asked the questions, really. So I think it's partially a case of getting that. Look at the code of practice, be inquisitive and ask those questions. If things go spectacularly wrong further down the line, well, you can't follow every truck to the nth degree. But if you've sent material out knowing that it was not going to a permitted site, then obviously that's culpable.
And getting third-party audits by Mike or other Mike Hibberts are available will help that, because you're specifically targeting, you're getting somebody independent to look at your systems and report to you. So don't be afraid to do that if you're not sure.
Thank you. We've got another couple of questions, but I'm very conscious that the clock is ticking and we have to finish on the dot. So I will get the questions answered and provide them as part of the feedback to everybody as well. But I'm conscious Nick's got his hand up.
Yeah, I guess all it was just a bit of a supplementary point to my question, Craig, Mike, Tina, that I guess the temptation is that if you, in my previous life, you've employed a licensed waste carrier appropriate to the type of waste that has been produced and you wish to dispose of, and it gets loaded onto a vehicle and you wave it goodbye, and the temptation is to think that you've done all that you needed to do. And I think the point that's coming across here is that may not be the case.
I think I agree, Nick. I think it's definitely not the case.
Definitely not the case.
Yeah. So, I kind of just wanted to summarize on that point for everybody and say, be very, very careful what you do and how you categorize your own best endeavors, your own due diligence, etc., and make sure it's aligned with the legal position, the position around best practice and legislation, etc. Thank you, everybody. Really interesting.